Dave Talks Comics, Episode 66, Uncanny X-Men 148 to 150. Welcome to Dave Talks Comics, a program on the subjects of comic books and cartoons. I talk about comics I have read and cartoons I have watched. I talk from my notes. I don't go panel by panel or scene by scene. I try to do more than just summarize the stories. This program is not spoiler-free. I try not to spoil everything, but in the process of talking about these comics and cartoons, I will probably spoil them in some way. Uncanny X-Men 148 to 150. This is an interesting run of comics. This is a run of comics, well, this is just 3 issues out of a run that I read when I was much younger. I wasn't collecting when these issues first came out, but it was like right after these that I started buying. So it was like right around 151 that I started buying. And I believe the subscription I had to X-Men started either with 151 or 153, but I can never remember which one it was. So the first of these issues is Cry Mutant. That's the title of the issue. It's written by Chris Claremont and drawn by Dave Cockrum with the inks by Josef Rubinstein. And it's cover dated August of 81. And there's basically 2 storylines that run through this issue. Or there's 2 main stories. And the first one kind of bookends the other. And that is the story of Scott Summers, Cyclops, and Lee Forrester. And they had previously crashed on an island. They had been on a boat. I believe she owned a boat, and he was working for her temporarily. This was in the period when he left the X-Men. And he was working for her. They had crashed. Now, I looked back. I have the essential. I'm reading these issues from Essential X-Men Volume 3. I don't have the original issues that I owned when I was a kid. I sold all of those years ago and didn't get very much money for them. But I've got the. So I looked back through this Volume 3 of Essential X-Men begins with issue 145, and there are vignettes in there where they are already crashed and on the island. So it must have happened before that. I believe Lee Forrester was introduced in issue 143, so it must have been in 143 or 144 that they actually crashed on the island. They got shipwrecked. In this issue, they discover another island right next to the island they were on, which wasn't there before, which has these huge buildings, which a city practically, which has these. It looks like came out of the sea. It's got all these weird designs, these almost Cthulhu-like statues in it, and so at the beginning of this issue, they are kind of exploring this. Now he has lost his visor, so he has tied a bandage or a piece of shirt or something around his eyes, and at one point that comes off, and he's eye blasts are shooting all over the place, and somehow he doesn't get injured, even though they show some rubble coming down. And also they get into a fight, and so that kind of adds some tension there. But by the end of the issue, they're back together again. But the bulk of this issue focuses on the rest of the team. The Wolverine and Nightcrawler and Storm and Colossus and Kitty. And I refer to her as Kitty. I'm not sure if she was Sprite or she was Ariel or she was Shadowcat at this point. And honestly, I can never keep that straight. I don't even know if there's a good way to determine which character she is at which point. So I just prefer to refer to her as Kitty. So that's where, okay, so the X-Men are, well, for the most part, this episode focuses on an event that happens in New York City, and that's when Storm and Kitty, along with Stevie Hunter, who is Kitty's dance instructor, go to, and Jessica Drew, Spider-Woman, go to a nightclub called Infinity, where they see, where the Dazzler is performing, Alison Blair. And there they are approached by another mutant, somebody who is appearing for the first time, a character named Caliban, who is one of the Morlocks, who are these mutants that live underneath New York City. And he doesn't look like them. He looks strange, and that's something that most of the Morlocks have, that they're not pretty. They look kind of disfigured, and I guess this was Chris Claremont trying to bring... I don't want to get too much into Morlocks right now. It's a couple years before he shows up again, I believe, or at least it's a couple years before that classic Morlock story where Storm has to assert herself and do something rather violent. And it's a great story, and that's during the Paul Smith run on X-Men. I believe it's Paul Smith. And it's not in this volume of Essential X-Men. I believe it would be in the next volume. It's in the low 169, 170, 171, somewhere around there. But Caliban is a mutant, and he comes out and he's drawn towards Storm and towards Kitty because they are mutants, and somehow he can detect them. He has some other powers to make people kind of project his shadows, it seems like, and he's kind of strong. He deals with some security guards who are armed with pistols rather easily. So he abducts Kitty, and he tries to take off with her, take her back underground with him, but Storm and Spider-Woman get in the way of that. They manage to catch up to him and prevent him from doing that. And it's a kind of weird story in a way, you know. I mean, if you stop and think about this, it's a little creepy what he does, you know. I mean, they act very nice towards him in the end, but at the same time, you know, he obviously strikes me as somebody who probably has some serious mental problems. I don't know. This does not seem like a reasonable solution to being lonely, to abduct somebody, to abduct a young teenage girl. It does not seem like a reasonable solution. It's criminal, and in addition to criminal, I don't think it's very moral. It isn't moral. The only other thing that I think worth mentioning, well, there's a couple things actually, is that Dazzler uses her powers twice. There's one point where Storm and Jessica Drew need to change into their costumes after Kitty has been abducted, and so Dazzler puts on this light show, and all of a sudden everybody in the club is staring at Dazzler, and so Jessica and Aurora can change while everybody's got their heads turned the other way. And let's see, you also see, I think this is the first time you see Kitty actually phasing through air and walking on air, and I think it's the first time because she seems kind of surprised that she's able to do that. And then finally, the only other thing worth mentioning about this issue is the fact that at the very end you get back to Scott and Lee on this island in the Bermuda Triangle, and they meet somebody who apparently lives on this island, whose island it is, and it's, who is it? Scott is blindfolded, but he still recognized the voice. It's Magneto. The next issue, number 149, is called "And the Dead Shall Bury the Living." Once again, the writer is Chris Claremont, and the penciler and inkers are Dave Cockrum and Joe Rubinstein. This issue also is, well, it's kind of, well, you don't get as much of Scott, and it certainly doesn't open with Scott and Lee. You get a little bit of them at the end of the issue, but it opens with Kitty demonstrating another new power, which is that she is able to disrupt electronics by phasing through them, and this becomes a big thing, a big power of hers over the years, and I wonder. This seems a bit like something that Claremont just came up with and then kind of became one of these ideas that they used quite a bit over the years. But the issue opens with Professor X reflecting on Magneto, and you get this whole several panels of him reflecting back on stories going back as far as the first issue of X-Men, and also on the X-Men's battle with Magneto in issues 112 to 114 when he kidnapped them and took them to his base underneath Antarctica, which is interesting because that's where the X-Men end up going in this episode. And because because Professor X wants them to go there. So it's just supposed to be Storm and Nightcrawler and Colossus and Wolverine, but Kitty stows away on the plane, the Blackbird, and so they all end up going to Antarctica. And it's there that they meet Garokk, although it's not really clear why they're going to Antarctica. It's just that Professor X wanted them to go he has an important mission for them. But they just, I mean, part of it, I think, is that Professor X suspects that Magneto's still around, but I'm really not sure. And I didn't really go through this and make really careful notes about what Professor X is. But anyway, so they break into the old base because it's kind of been blocked off and buried under some rubble. They find one of the old robots that Magneto used to use to keep them when he had them captured. And then they reflect on this guy named Garokk. And he shows up. And he's somebody who had fallen through the earth. And Storm had tried to rescue him but was unable to rescue him. And he comes back and he was already like a man made of stone. But something happens to him that... so he's now like half stone and like half like melted, and so they end up fighting with him, and you see Kitty phasing through him, and apparently that slows him down a little bit, even though he's not an android or anything or a robot. But I mean, basically it's a fight. I don't know. This story doesn't really add a whole lot in my mind. It's kind of a growing up story for Kitty. She definitely, it's a chance for her to prove herself. Not that she saves the day, I don't think, in this issue, but she definitely goes through a bit of a trial, and they rely on her to use her ability to walk on air at one point to go down into this pit where Storm has fallen and she's unconscious. And that's really about it for issue 148, or 149, I'm sorry. And although just one final thing, which is that on the final page you get a little bit more of Scott and Lee and Magneto reveals that he knows who Scott is because he didn't in the previous issue. The final issue I'm going to talk about is number 150. It's called I, Magneto. Once again, written by Chris Claremont, pencils by Dave Cockrum, and the inks are by Joe Rubinstein and Bob Wyacek in this case. Magneto's up to his old tricks. He's trying to blackmail the world once again. This may be the first time he takes the cause. He's doing more than just blackmailing the world. He's also saying that they are responsible for hunting down mutants and killing mutants. This may be a precursor to, let's see, this was 1981, so this was a couple years before, but this may be a bit of a precursor to the X-Men graphic novel, God Loves, Man Kills, which I should pull off my shelf and see if I can figure out exactly when that was released, how much later than this that came out. Let's see. Well, it says 1982 in here, so this would have been very soon. So this is definitely in line with God Loves. It's of the same era as God Loves, Man Kills. And he's threatening the world leaders. You see Brezhnev, you see Ronald Reagan, you see the Chinese premier. You see some other world leaders. Now, the Russians aren't very appreciative, or they don't take him too seriously. They send a submarine after him to blow up the island, and he basically deals with the submarine by blowing up the submarine or sinking the submarine. They fired missiles at the island. He takes care of that. Then he wipes out a Russian city, although they are careful to say that he doesn't kill anybody, that he actually gives them time to evacuate people. Now, the X-Men are on their way back from Antarctica, and what happens so they're flying back, and for some reason they're going through the Bermuda Triangle. Because they're going right past Magneto's island, Magneto has built this inhibiting device which inhibits their powers. And it also has some effect on the X-Men's plane, apparently, because all of a sudden the controls are frozen. They kind of go flying out of control. They're hoping that Storm can help to use her weather powers to control the plane, but which she does. But at first she gets knocked out by Wolverine, and but they manage to make a crash landing in the water just at the last minute. So the X-Men, most of the ones who were in the previous issue in Antarctica, all the ones who were in the previous issue in Antarctica, arrive at the island. They meet up with Cyclops, but of course, like Cyclops, they find out that all their powers are inhibited, so they can't use their powers. Colossus can't turn to steel. Kitty can't phase through things. Wolverine has no healing ability, although they don't. I think at this point they didn't emphasize that quite as much as they would later on. And I think I've mentioned that on a previous episode of Dave Talks Comics. But Nightcrawler can't teleport, and Storm can't use her weather powers, so they kind of have to fall back on their own abilities and things that have nothing to do with their mutant abilities. So Wolverine still has his claws, and Nightcrawler is still a great acrobat, and, Kitty knows something about computers, and, so they've got these abilities. So they kind of split up. Since Cyclops has told them about this machine that is inhibiting their powers, they go looking for it. So Cyclops and so the guys, Cyclops and Wolverine and Nightcrawler and Colossus go looking for it, and they find it and they take it out. But later in the issue, you'll see that doesn't do a whole lot of good because Magneto's able to recreate it at a moment's notice. And I think this generator idea is kind of interesting because Magneto has used this kind of thing before, and I know this is a comic book, and I probably shouldn't take it too seriously, but it's kind of funny how he's just able to, I have a device that will inhibit all your powers, but not mine, and brings down the plane, and it just, it seems a little kooky, But it is kind of neat to see the X-Men have to rely on their abilities other than and not have superpowers and have to fight Magneto that way, and honestly they're not too successful in fighting him that way, and it really isn't until they are able to knock out his machine and regain their powers that the fight really gets interesting. Before that, you get an interesting moment where Storm finds Magneto's bedroom. He's there asleep, and there's a knife, and she's thinking about should she kill him. She could kill him, but she doesn't want to do that, and she's opposed to killing. And you really there's a great shot in there of her eyes, and you see the sweat coming down her brow because she's not sure what to do. And in that moment of hesitation, Magneto wakes up and throws her out a window. And she barely survives, because of course she can't fly because of his machine. And there's this great scene of Magneto getting up and putting on his uniform by pulling it magnetically onto his body molecule by molecule, and that's pretty cool. Then he fights with Professor X, and Professor X assaults him psychically because Professor X is on a boat that's nearby. And now it's not near enough to affect his powers. He isn't within the field that would inhibit his powers. So what Magneto does is he uses magnetic abilities to bring Professor X to the island, thus knocking out his powers. And then at that point, he recreates the machine, which Colossus and Wolverine and Nightcrawler thought they had destroyed. But then Storm destroys the power source or something for the machine, and all of a sudden they've got their powers back. And then it's on. And then there's this great fight between the X-Men and Magneto. And I think this is the highlight of the issue, and this is what I really like. I mean, yeah, it's that, and it's... Okay, it's not just that. I mean, like I said, I did like the parts where the X-Men had to rely on their own abilities, their non-mutant abilities, to try and get things done. And then the other thing that's interesting about this is that Magneto isn't just a bad guy in this issue. You start to see a little bit of change in him here. And when he thinks that Kitty has destroyed some of his computers, he flips out, kind of like Professor X flipped out on her in issue 148. 149. Yeah, it was the beginning of 149 that he flipped out on Kitty. But the difference here is that Magneto, is ready to kill her, and he's got these lightning powers. I don't completely understand that. Just like, how is he able to psychically battle with Professor X, which is something that goes back to, like, his first appearance. That's never really explained. I haven't looked at his entry in the official handbook of the Marvel Universe. I don't know if there's any real explanation of it, but he definitely has powers other than magnetism. But when he sees what he's done to Kitty, when he sees that he's almost killed her, then he kind of, all of a sudden, he breaks down, and it changes him, And in subsequent appearances, and actually this is really the last Magneto appearance that I've really read, I think, because I don't think he shows up again until in like the 190s or something like that. And I mean, unless you count God Loves, Man Kills, his appearance in there. But anyway, I really enjoyed this issue. It's definitely my favorite of the three. I enjoyed rereading all three because X-Men is a book that has these long-running stories where these little things that'll come up, like the whole bit of Scott and Lee. Claremont has been putting that in these comics, just little bits of them, in issue 148 and issue 148, and then 150, everything finally comes together. So, 150 is definitely, the climax of this story is definitely the best one, but I enjoyed rereading all of them. Do I think they're all great stories? Not really. I'm not sure that I would recommend them all to most people, but certainly if you're an X-Men fan or a Marvel Comics fan, a superhero fan, I would certainly recommend 150. The other two issues, maybe not so much, but I definitely enjoyed rereading all three of these issues. Couple more things specifically about characters whose powers I was unclear on when I was recording this episode. I checked with the official handbook of the Marvel Universe, the original edition. Caliban appears in the appendix of issue 2. He just gets a one-sentence entry. It says, grotesque mutant with unusual strength who shuns humanity. That's it. And his first appearance was Uncanny X-Men 148, and that was his only appearance at this point. It would be later that year that he would show up in the storyline that ran from X-Men 169 to 170 or 171. I'm not sure. But he certainly was in 169 and 170. And that was the Morlock storyline when all the other Morlocks were introduced. And that was only his second appearance. So he had no appearances in between the two. So it's really unclear what his powers are, although it does seem in the story as if he can project himself, that he's projecting this shadow, and he somehow detects that Kitty and Storm, who are mutants, and I guess Dazzler, since Dazzler's also a mutant, are in this nightclub, Infinity. Infinity, that's what it was called. Okay, the other character was, I talked a little bit about Magneto's abilities and how it was a little fuzzy, and looking at his entry in the official handbook, it kind of makes him sound like he's all-powerful. Well, not necessarily all-powerful, but extremely powerful. It says, although Magneto's power is not on the level of the Silver Surfer in his prime, it is for all practical purposes limitless. Wow, isn't that... And it does say something about he can... He can completely assemble a complicated machine within seconds through his powers, which of course is one of the things that I mentioned happens in issue 150. And as far as his magnetic powers, or his electrical powers, it says that although Magneto's primary power is magnetism, he seems to have some ability to project or manipulate any form of energy that is related to magnetism. And it talks about radio waves, ultraviolet, gamma rays, X-rays. Let's see, I'm not sure if it's anything about lightning, but yeah, so he's just extremely powerful and it does say something about he has exhibited powers of astral projection and telepathy and has claimed to be able to control the minds of others. His abilities along these lines are minimal, however, enough perhaps to protect himself against mightier telepaths, but not of great use otherwise. So it just seems kind of convenient that all of a sudden he has these powers when he needs to defend himself against somebody like Professor X. But hey, that's been in his history. That goes all the way back to the beginning, so it's not like it's something they just introduced in the early 80s. It was there in the early 60s. That's it for episode 66 of Dave Talks Comics. Dave Talks Comics can be found on the web at davetalkscomics.com and facebook.com/DaveTalksComics. On Twitter, at Dave Talks Comics. Email can be sent to davetalkscomics@gmail.com. Next time on Dave Talks Comics, I'll be talking about a couple of Batman stories, one from the late 80s and one from the early 90s, one of which is fairly well known. The other one I don't think is, and I'm not sure if it's ever been reprinted. I'm Dave. Thank you for listening. Dave Talks Comics, episode 66.